portrait arrived at my shop on a rainy afternoon in October 1923, wrapped in black cloth and carried by a man who refused to tell me where he had found it. I was 37 then, the proprietor of a modest antiquarian bookshop in Bloomsbury, London. Paintings were not my business, but the stranger seemed remarkably determined that I should have this particular one. He placed it against my counter and said, "Keep it somewhere people can see it." When I asked what price he wanted, he smiled without humor. "You couldn't afford what it costs." Then he walked into the rain and disappeared. I should have left the cloth exactly where it was. Instead, curiosity won. Beneath it was an oil portrait of a gentleman seated in a dark green armchair. He appeared to be about 40, elegantly dressed in the fashion of the late 18th century. His face was handsome but unpleasant, with narrow eyes and a small smile that suggested he knew something amusing about whoever happened to be looking at him. One hand rested on a silver-topped cane. The other held a pocket watch. A brass plate on the frame gave his name as Augustus Vail, 1764 to 1829. The artist's name had been carefully scratched away. I hung the portrait behind the counter. That evening, shortly before closing, an elderly customer named Mrs. Davenport stopped to admire it. She stared for several seconds before asking why I kept a portrait of a dead man in my shop. I pointed out that almost every portrait from the 18th century depicted somebody dead. She didn't smile. "No," she said. "I mean that man is dead." I looked again. Vail appeared perfectly normal. Mrs. Davenport stepped closer and suddenly gasped. His eyes moved. I assured her it was simply the effect of varnish catching the light. She left without purchasing anything. The following morning I noticed that Augustus Vail looked older, not dramatically. There were simply lines around his eyes that I did not remember seeing before. His hair seemed grayer at the temples. I blamed the changing daylight. 3 days later, however, there could be no mistake. Vail had aged perhaps 10 years. His cheeks had become hollow and his hands were thinner. Even stranger, the pocket watch he held had changed. When the portrait arrived, its hands showed 20 minutes past 3. They now showed 3:45. I removed the painting from the wall and examined it beneath a lamp. The paint was dry and ancient. Nothing had been altered. I began researching Augustus Vail. He had been a wealthy physician who lived near London during the Georgian period. Contemporary accounts described him as charming, educated, and unusually interested in the possibility of extending human life. His wife died mysteriously in 1801. 2 servants disappeared from his household during the following decade. Vail himself supposedly died in 1829 at the age of 65. There was, however, no record of his burial. More disturbing was a newspaper advertisement from 1837 offering a reward for the return of a stolen family portrait. The advertisement described the painting hanging behind my counter. That night I stayed late. I placed a chair opposite the portrait and watched. At midnight, the shop clock chimed. Vail's painted eyes moved towards me. There was no illusion this time. His pupils shifted slowly until he was looking directly into my face. The pocket watch advanced by 1 minute. I stood so quickly that my chair overturned. Vail smiled. Then something impossible happened. His painted chest rose beneath his waistcoat as he took a breath. A faint whisper came from the canvas. Closer, I backed towards the door. Vail's smile widened. "Please," he said, "I cannot see you properly from there." I covered the painting and left. The following morning, the black cloth lay neatly folded on the floor. Vail had aged another 20 years. He was now an elderly man, his skin sagging and spotted, his once dark hair almost white. Yet something else had changed. Behind him, painted into the shadowy background, stood a woman. She had not been there before. I recognized Mrs. Davenport. Her face was pale and frightened. She appeared to be pressing both hands against the inside of the canvas. I telephoned her home. Her daughter answered and told me Mrs. Davenport had died during the night. I immediately carried the portrait into the cellar and turned it towards the wall. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third morning, I found it hanging behind the counter again. I had locked the cellar myself. Vale was now impossibly old. His face had collapsed into deep folds, and one milky eye stared from beneath a drooping lid. Mrs. Davenport remained behind him. There were others now, a young maid, a bearded gentleman, a little old woman wearing mourning clothes. Their painted faces seemed to emerge from the darkness surrounding Vale's chair. On the table beside him stood a glass decanter that had not been there before. That afternoon a man entered the shop and asked whether I possessed a portrait of Augustus Vale. His name was Professor Henry Mercer, an art historian from Cambridge. When I showed him the painting, he became visibly frightened. Mercer had been searching for it for 14 years. He claimed the portrait had appeared repeatedly throughout the 19th century. Every owner reported the same phenomenon. Vale aged while people around the painting died. Then, when the figure reached extreme old age, something happened. What? I asked. Mercer looked towards the portrait. He becomes young again. I laughed nervously. Paintings do not become young. Mercer did not respond. He opened a leather folder containing photographs. One showed the portrait in 1872. Augustus Vale looked approximately 40. Another, taken 5 years later, showed him as an ancient man. A final photograph from 1878 showed Vale young again. Standing behind his chair were 11 additional figures. Mercer tapped them with one finger. All 11 died while the portrait was in that house. I looked towards my painting. Vale's remaining eye seemed fixed upon us. Mercer whispered, "I believe the portrait isn't aging." He is. That evening we decided to destroy it. We carried the painting into the courtyard behind my shop and soaked the canvas with paraffin. Mercer struck a match. Before he could drop it, a voice came from the portrait. "Henry." Mercer froze. Vale no longer looked old. He was watching us. "Henry," he repeated. "Your mother has been waiting." Behind his chair, a woman appeared. Mercer made a choking sound. Mother, the painted woman lifted her hand. "Henry, darling." Mercer stepped forward. I grabbed him. He fought me with surprising strength, shouting that his mother was alive inside the painting. Then Vale began laughing. His face changed as we watched. The wrinkles disappeared. His back straightened. White hair darkened. Roll. The transformation happened within seconds. Augustus Vale became a young man of perhaps 25. At the same time, Professor Mercer screamed. His hair turned gray. His skin tightened against his skull. He aged decades before my eyes. I tried to hold him, but his body became impossibly light. His clothes collapsed around him. Within moments, I was holding the dried remains of an old man in the portrait. Mercer appeared behind Vale's chair. He looked young again. His mother stood beside him. I dropped the match. Flames covered the canvas. Every figure inside the painting screamed. The sound did not come from the courtyard. It came from somewhere far away, as though dozens of people were trapped at the bottom of a deep well. Vale stood from his painted chair, his expression twisted with rage. For the first time, I saw what had been hidden behind him. The room in the portrait had no walls. Beyond the chair stretched an enormous darkness filled with faces, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Vale reached towards me. His painted fingers pressed against the surface of the canvas, stretching it outward like skin. The fire suddenly went out. The painting remained untouched. Vale was standing now, very close to the painted surface. His youthful face filled almost the entire canvas. "You cannot burn time," he whispered. I understood then. Augustus Vale had found his immortality. The portrait aged instead of his body. But eventually it required another life to renew him. Every person it consumed gave him more years. He had not died in 1829. He had simply disappeared into his own painting. The portrait was not preserving his image. It was preserving him. I took the only action I could think of. I smashed the shop's large front window, carried the portrait outside, and dragged it into the street. Vale screamed at me to stop. I placed the painting face down beneath the wheels of a delivery lorry parked nearby. Then I woke the driver and told him somebody was stealing his vehicle. The frightened man started the engine and drove forward. The wooden frame shattered beneath the tires. I heard Vale scream once when I lifted the remains. The canvas had split from top to bottom. Behind the painted surface was another layer of canvas, then another and another. I peeled them apart. Each contained a different portrait of Augustus Vale from a different century. Old, young again. Beneath the final layer was not canvas at all. It was human skin, dry and yellow with age. Written across it in brown ink were dozens of names. Mrs. Davenport, Professor Mercer, people stretching back more than 100 years. At the bottom was an empty space. I burned every piece separately. This time the fire took them. By dawn, nothing remained except ash. For the rest of my life, I never owned another portrait. I sold the shop in 1951 and retired to Sussex. I died in 1968. You may reasonably wonder how I can tell you anything beyond that point. The answer lies in something discovered last year during renovations to the old Bloomsbury building. Workers removed a wall behind what had once been my counter. Inside they found a narrow cavity containing a painting. It was a portrait of me. I was seated in a dark green armchair. One hand rested upon a silver-topped cane. The other held a pocket watch. Behind me stood Mrs. Davenport and Professor Mercer. The workers photographed the painting before placing it in storage. 3 days later, one of them noticed something strange about the photograph. I was smiling. According to the man who took it, I had not been smiling before. Yesterday, the painting disappeared from storage. Nobody knows who took it. But somewhere tonight, perhaps in an antique shop, a market stall, or hanging innocently on the wall of a newly furnished home, somebody may be looking at the portrait of an old gentleman named Arthur Pembroke. If you happen to see it, don't worry about the man in the chair. Look behind him. Because Augustus Vale is standing in the darkness again, and this